Okay, we're ready to get started. I'm Guy McLean. I'm the director here at the Athenaeum. I'm so glad to see such a great turnout again for Bob's second lecture. I want to just put in a couple of words advertising future events. Next week, next Thursday night, we have our first in a series of 3 chamber music concerts coming up. The tickets are selling rapidly, so if you want to get a ticket, please get one soon. The tickets are $25, but if you want the entire series of 3 concerts, you get a $10 discount. So it's $65 rather than $75 if you buy all 3 tickets. So keep that in mind. There's also an art exhibit that just opened earlier this month. Christine Hartman is on display in the art gallery upstairs. She'll be on exhibit until the end of March. And then in April, we have our student show. So there's just a couple of things coming up. Just wanted to let everyone know about. And also too, just to remind you too, events like this and other events that we have here, you can always go onto our website and check under the events to see what's coming up, because I always have people say to me, oh, I didn't hear, they hear about a program. Oh, I didn't hear about that. And I say, just check on the internet, just do it once a week, put that on your list of things to do once a week, just because we have so many programs that we're offering. So that's what I wanted to say in terms of advertising. Bob really doesn't need, I don't think to anybody in Westfield, Bob needs an introduction. So I'll just turn it over to Bob, let him take it from here. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, thank you for coming out on this rather gray, damp day. Those of you who weren't here the last time, as I said, the idea for this was just to do a small group thing so that I could show documents, because they don't work for an exhibit in a museum, and they don't really work putting them up on display if you don't know what the context is. So the idea is that I would pull out selective documents and talk about them in terms of why is it here, why is it important, and what does a professional historian do with them, so you can understand some Westfield history. Now, the first talk, I talked about the development of wealth among one of the leading families in town. Today, I'm going to be talking about diaries, journals, and memoirs. Next month, I'm going to deal with church records, particularly the first church, because we have all the original records for the first church going back into the 1600s. And so let's go to diaries, journals, and memoirs. Now, the 3 are different. We have very few diaries. That's because diaries are personal. Diaries are kept by people who want to somehow verbalize their thoughts, and at least the intention is no one else is ever going to see them. So diaries are so personal that they seldom appear in records. What most commonly appears are journals. Journals are a record of events. They're an aid memoir. They're to help you remember events as much as anything else. And if other people see them, well, that's not a big problem. And you can refer to them from time to time. Memoirs are something entirely different. Memoirs usually happen when someone is beginning to feel a little long in the tooth and suddenly recognizing that time is passing very, very fast, and you want to say things to those who will come after you. You think there are things that are important for them to know. So memoirs are written specifically for an audience. Now we have representatives of all 3 kinds, and I want to start with journals. Now, journals can be short-term or long-term. A short-term journal is something that I'll bet almost every one of you has kept. You take a trip, and so you begin to write down notes of what you saw on the trip. That's the most common thing. A short-term journal represents a singular moment in time. You're doing something unusual and you want to keep a record of it. Now, we've got a lot of those around. And I want to start with the short-term journal of Asa Clark. Now, Asa Clark was a druggist here in town in the early part of the 19th century. And in late 1848, notice arrived on the East Coast that gold had been discovered in California. Well, that instantly started a craze. In the next year, between 80,000 and 100,000 mostly male citizens of the East Coast of the United States struck out for California. Now, that happened here too. Now, the notice arrived in Washington, D.C. that gold had been discovered in California in November of 1848. On January 11th, there was a meeting in Springfield that 150 people attended to discuss what to do about that information. And on January 25th, 2 weeks later, 52 residents of Western Massachusetts had organized themselves into the Hamden Mining and Trading Company and had gotten on a train for New York City, where they got on a boat and sailed for the Rio Grande, for Matamoros, Mexico. This was an instant rush. Among those 52 men, there were at least 11 who were from Westfield. The leader of the company was a Mr. Harding from Westfield. Tell you, I don't know anything about him. I've got to tell you that in each of these cases, I have not spent weeks or months trying to figure out what's going on. These are short-term stories, and if you get interested in, you can do the digging. But a Mr. Harding from Westfield was the leader of the company. And the secretary of the company, the young man who was deputated with keeping a record of what happened, was Asa Clark, the druggist from Westfield. This is his journal that he kept on the trip. Now, they sailed from New York City for the mouth of the Rio Grande to the Mexican city of Matamoros. Now, if you know anything about the gold rush and the history of the gold rush to California, you know that some people traveled across the country. Now, that was an obvious way to go, but the huge middle of the United States, from essentially the Mississippi River to California proper, was empty and hostile. It was dangerous, but it was cheap. That was the cheapest way to go. Now, if you had a little money, you went by ship. You got on a ship and you sailed around Cape Horn and up to California. But that could take you 7 months. And maybe all the gold would have been found by that time. So very quickly, and we're talking here in a matter of weeks as people are making these decisions, most people took a ship from the East Coast of the United States to the coast of Panama and crossed that 50-mile little stretch across Panama and hoped to catch a ship on the other side. The only problem with that is there was no route across Panama. It was one of the god-awfulest, worst jungles on the face of the earth. And it was a hotbed of some of the worst diseases on earth. Any parties that crossed that way during the 1840s was guaranteed to lose between 10 and 50% of their members to mostly yellow fever as they crossed in that route. It was deadly. I never thought of any other route. I knew something about the gold rush. I knew about these trips. I knew about those paths. There was another route to California, an easy route. And the Westfield party took it. Across northern Mexico. There were towns and roads all the way across there. 1 year previous, the United States had defeated Mexico in the Mexican War. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was in 1848, just 4 months before the announcement of the discovery of gold. You could land at the Mexican city of Matamoros on the Rio Grande and following Mexican highways and Mexican settled towns all across Mexico. And that's what our party does. This is a description of crossing Mexico to California. Now, it still is a tough trip. It was going to take them about 3 months. And it was 1,700 miles across Mexico. Now, once you get across Mexico, you still got to cross Arizona. And then you're only in Southern California, and San Francisco is a long way north. There's still a major trip. Well, the Hamden Mining and Trading Company doesn't make it. They fall apart about halfway across Mexico, and Asa Clark gets sick and ends up staying in a Mexican town for almost a month before he gets well enough to continue on his journey. He ultimately makes it. He gets to the gold fields of California. And like almost everybody else who was a 49er who went out to California to mine gold, he doesn't find any. He goes broke. Now, he's ambitious. He buys a deerskin money belt. And a deerskin vest with money pockets, hidden money pockets in it. But he never finds any gold to fill it with. He clerks in a store for about a year and comes back to Westfield, broke, but having seen the world. And he brings with him his journal. Somehow, he gets the idea that other people might be interested in the journal. And in 1852, it is published as Travels in Mexico and California. Now, this is a reprint of the 1852 book. If you are interested in Asa Clark and the Westfield men who went to California for gold, you can read their story. You probably wouldn't have access to the journal, but you can read their story in the edited copy of the journal. This is in the reference room upstairs, and so you can get it and read the story. By the way, Asa Clark is not the only Westfield man who went. There were Fowlers and Loomises and Mosleys, and representatives of those 3 families didn't find gold either, but they found a California that they liked. They stayed out there, they settled around Lodi, California, and descendants of all 3 of those families are there to this day. Now, long-term journals are a different thing. long-term journals, and it takes a particular kind of a mindset to keep a long-term journal. I had one aunt who did. Her entire adult life, at least as far as I'm aware, she kept a journal. Because every once in a while, questions would come up in the family. Well, when did this happen? And she'll say, "Oh, I'll check." And she would go and dig out her journal for that year, and she could find when exactly a building was burned down or built, or when somebody did something else. She had it in her journal. People who keep long-term journals are almost fanatic about it. They're going to do it most of their lives. They're not going to just do it for a year or two and then quit. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because of our next journal. Now, the longest journal we have is one that no one's ever done anything with. I've looked at it a couple of times and decided I just didn't have the energy. We have a 50-year journal, the first half of the 20th century, kept by O.E. Parks. Now, I don't know, there may be a couple of you in here. I know there are a number of you who remember the O.B. Parks hardware store on the north side. That was his father. O.E. Parks was the city engineer from the 1890s to about 1940. He killed himself in 1947, but he kept a journal for all those years. We have those here. The journal I want to talk about is someone who's kind of much more interesting. That's the journal of Aurelia Taylor. Now, Aurelia Taylor was born in the 1780s, and she died in 1844. We have her journal for the last 12 years of her life, from 1832 to 1844. This is it. And I think you can see that this is not someone who at the age of 45 is suddenly going to start keeping this kind of a journal. That she undoubtedly had earlier volumes. They just have not survived in our collection. But here is 12 years, highly detailed, of her life. Now, who was she? Well, she was the great granddaughter of Edward Taylor, the original pastor of the first church. She is the granddaughter. Edward Taylor had 3 wives and 14 children. His last child, a son, Eldad, was born when Edward was in his 70s. She is the granddaughter of Eldad. Her home still stands. If you go out Main Street, right at the stoplight where Meadow Street comes in, on your right-hand side, there's a little nondescript white house, sits very tight to the road. I have problems with it because I drive that road a lot, and they put their garbage can right out on the edge of the road. That was her house. That was her father's house. It is an 18th century house that you wouldn't notice, but it sits right there. She did, as many daughters have throughout history, ended up not marrying and staying and taking care of her mother and father until suddenly one day she's in her 40s and they're gone and she's at home. She made a living by weaving whiplashes. And it's one of the things that we can use in order to understand the whip industry, because an awful lot of the whip industry was, before we get into the late 19th century, was done in the homes, and it was done by women. who don't appear on the economic records. But she made a living by braiding whiplashes at home, and the records of her employment and her pay are all here in her journal. For convention's sake, I assume she decided she ought to be married. And she does marry in her late 40s, and it's a disaster. And so she divorces very quickly too. And she makes it plain in her journal that this was clearly a mistake and she ought to get on with her life. She is a very independent person. She is related to most of the great families in town, although her status is not their status. She is a cousin of James Fowler, the Fowler estate that I talked about the last time. And when he builds his new mansion, the Boys and Girls Library here, she describes it in there, and he has a big housewarming. And she's invited to the housewarming as a cousin, but she decides that she wouldn't feel comfortable working and being around those folks. She's just not comfortable. The one thing, I've read her journal a couple of times, and the one thing that's important for me, if you look at most of the newspaper accounts and the other written histories of Westfield, it sort of looks like the whole abolition, pro and anti-slavery struggles of the 40s and 50s doesn't happen in Westfield. There's very little information on it. In her journal, there's a lot of information. She's a Methodist, and the Methodists, unlike the establishment Congregationalists in town, the Methodists were prone for reform and new ideas. And she's regularly going to Methodist meetings to hear abolitionist speakers. So we can get a view into one level of activity in town we can't get anywhere else from her journal. Her journal is well written. It's almost as if she's carrying on a conversation with neighbors. It's not dull, hot today, worked hard kind of journal. There's a conversation going on. Now, we're lucky, and you're lucky, because once again, probably there'd be very limited access to what I just showed you. But in the 1940s and 50s, there was a very active local historian here that most people have forgotten. Her name was Eloise Fowler Salmon. Eloise was active in the Historical Society. She wrote a history of Mundale. If any of you are from that area, she wrote the history of Mundale. She wrote all kinds of research histories, and because of who she is a Fowler by birth. She's associated with the proper families, and so she gets access to lots of things. And she prepared a typescript of this journal, and she did something more. She prepared guides, because Aurelia writes about doing all kinds of things, and we've forgotten the vocabulary for us. So Eloise prepared a vocabulary of what does it mean when she says she's doing this. She also prepares a biographical guide. So when she mentions that she sees cousin Flora, she tells you who Flora is and what the relationship. So you can read this with the guide and get a very good feel of Westfield in the 1830s and 40s. Aurelia's last entry is in July of 1844, and she dies 2 weeks later. She is the last of her line, the last of the family in town. Direct line. of tailors. We wish we had the earlier years. There must have been earlier years. But we're terribly proud of the fact that we've got these 12 years. Now, the third person I want to talk about is simply not a good example of either diaries or journals or memoirs. He's just a damn fascinating person that we have some record of. And the few things we have a record of him, you don't get access to. And he's not known. His name is Phineas Tinker. Phineas Lyman Tinker. When he was about 30 years old, he decided he didn't like the name Tinker, and he changed it to Buell. He got an act of the legislature in the Commonwealth to change it to Buell. Never clear explanation of why. And so in most of the stuff, he appears as Phineas Lyman Buell. Born in 1809, died in 1893. He was born in Granville. His father died when he was young, and so he was put out to work. And remember, we're talking about the 1820s here. This is a long time ago. He was healthy and hearty and 12 years old, and so they sent him out to work, support the family. He wanted an education, and so he got a little bit here and a little bit there, and ultimately got enough of an education so that he could apply to come to the Westfield Academy. You know, that was the private school that existed before the Westfield High School sat over where the fire department is. And he attended the Westfield Academy, got a little better education there, and became a school teacher. Now, I began all this mess, 50, 60 years ago, up at the former Westfield Normal School, Westfield State Teachers College, Westfield State College, and now Westfield University, where we train teachers. And one of the things that we always stressed up there is that teaching is one of those fascinating jobs. Everybody considers it important, but nobody's willing to pay for it. And so it tends to be a terrible job if you're actually doing it quite often. Well, that was really true in the 19th century. I mean, you couldn't make much of a living at it. And if you all remember the story of Ichabod Crane, teachers were a pretty itinerant lot. Well, that was true of him. He taught briefly in the one-room schools in Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York, and even got down to New Jersey. And then suddenly in 1838, he had an experience. The first half of the 19th century in America was a time of bubbling isms. Some of you may have heard of the Burnt Over district in Western New York State. That's where Shakerism and the Oneida movement and the Mormon movement and the Fox sisters with spiritualism, and there were all kinds of isms bubbling up everywhere. It was also a world in which death stalked everyone. Medicine had not made the advances that technology had, and death was ever present. There was a desperate attempt to apply the new sciences and new technology to everything in life, and somebody in Europe, the name most commonly associated is a Frenchman by the name of Combe, got the bright idea that the seat of the human being was, unlike in medieval Europe, it wasn't your soul. And unlike Romantic Europe, it wasn't your heart, it was your brain. Now, if your brain was the center of your existence and you couldn't see the brain, how were you going to understand something about people? Well, they got this genius idea that because our heads are shaped differently from person to person, that somehow that would tell you something about the brain. And if you knew something about the brain, you'd know something about the person. It was called phrenology. In simple terms, they felt the bumps on your head and made prognostications about your personality, your future, your love life, whatever you wanted. They felt the bumps on your head. 1838, somebody felt the bumps on his head and he discovered this was the greatest idea in the world. And you certainly, because you charge people to feel the bumps on their head, that you could make more money at it than you could teaching school in a one-room country schoolhouse. And so he began wandering in these same states, feeling bumps on people's heads. Well, he ran into an entrepreneur who maybe was a little more ambitious or a little smarter or something than he was. A fellow by the name of Sizer from Chester, Massachusetts. Now, Mr. Sizer, some of you may know Mr. Sizer's descendant, Quentin. He was his descendant. I'm not absolutely sure. I actually think Quentin was a great grandson, to tell you the truth. Mr. Sizer was the entrepreneur that Mr. Buell needed. And the team of Nelson Sizer and Phineas Lyman Buell became big time. This is their published book. Now you can't read it. It says, A Guide to Phrenology and the Fundamental Principles of Phrenology, to which are adapted a phrenological chart illustrated by engravings by P.L. Buell and N. Sizer, phrenologists, published in 1842. And this is what you paid them for. This is your personal chart. You pay, some of you may have seen these in the antiques world. These ceramic heads exist every once in a while. Sometimes they pop up in the antiques world. This happens to be the little booklet that you paid for, and you got checked off in this about the different bumps on your head and what your qualities were, and attested to that's what your future was. Now, this was part and parcel of a whole lot of reform movements, because the advertising or other books which they sold in these, there is advertising for women's rights issues, abolition, the water cure, take baths and enemas, made you healthy. For all kinds of health cures and reform movements, they were advertising and selling all these books. They're traveling reformers. Phineas marries a Westfield girl, and she says, well, it's time to settle down. So he has to find another occupation. In 1851, he buys a half interest in the Westfield newspaper. And within a couple of years, he becomes the sole owner. And for the next 20 years, he is the editor and publisher of the Westfield newspaper. Now, I'll tell you that during those 20 years, 1851 to 1871, The Westfield newspaper supports all of these issues. You will find editorials in there supporting women's rights, supporting abolition, supporting reforms in medicine, supporting all of the isms of the day. It becomes a reform newspaper. It is Whig in its politics, and what that means by the time we get to the 1850s, they become big backers of the Republican Party and Lincoln and all the rest. He's such a big supporter of the isms and of the reform movement that in the mid-1850s, when an almost civil war breaks out in Kansas, those of you who know some history know it's called Bleeding Kansas. And there is the New England Emigrant Company. 3,000 citizens of New England were encouraged to move to Kansas carrying Beecher's Bibles. That meant rifles, to go out and fight the Jayhawkers from Missouri. Ewell goes out to see what he can do about this and writes it up in his newspaper about the battles over Bleeding Kansas, over abolition. So he represents reform in Westfield in the mid-19th century. By 1871, he's getting old and the newspaper business is tough and you don't make a lot of money at it. So he needed a more permanent job. He became the librarian of this place. And he held that job for the rest of his life. Now, he might have been totally forgotten, except for one little other thing about him. As I said, he married. He and his wife lived on Franklin Street on the corner of Washington. They had a little home there. He was next door to one of the whip makers in town, a man by the name of Henry Ely. Joseph Minor Ely. Gotta get my Ely straight. Ely had a son, Henry, and one of Phineas's daughters marries Henry. So Phineas Lyman Tinker Buell is the grandfather of Governor Joe Ely. A little bit of claim to fame. Now, we don't have a diary or a memoir of him. What we have are his little books, and we have a collection of letters that he sent back home to his mother when he was wandering around the eastern part of the United States. We also have his newspaper, and we have various comments about him. So he doesn't really fit the diaries, but he does fit the fact that we've got stuff in here about him, and he's an important character to remember. The last of the people I want to talk about is I want to talk about in terms of memoir. One of the largest collection of papers that we've got here are the Fowler/Gillette family papers. They're kept in document boxes like this, and we have, I don't know, 8 or 9 boxes full of their documents. Multi-generations of their letters and diaries and memoirs. There's some difficulty dealing with them because, like all good Yankee families, good religious Yankee families of the 19th century, they repeated names. Now, I don't know about your families, but I am Robert Brown the 4th. My son is the 5th. My grandson is the 6th. And it gets irritating. I tried to work on my family genealogy. My family came from Scotland. 3 brothers, James, John, and Robert, who had 3 to 4 sons each, whom they named James, John, and Robert. A number of whom had sons, whom they named James, John, and Robert. So when you try to work genealogy, you can't figure out who was who. Well, that's the trouble with the Fowler family. They had Samuel, James, and for females, they had Lucy. We've got 3 generations of Lucy. We've got Lucy who married James, the man who built the house, the man I talked about last time. And their daughter, Lucy, who married Gillett, the big attorney in town. And their daughter, and I don't know whether there's anybody, well, there might be somebody here who barely remembers her. She died in 1949. She was Miss Lucy. She's the one who's the backbone of the YMCA and the Westfield Women's Club and the Hopefully Well Affected and others. So we've got the papers and records and memoirs of all of them. I told you we didn't have many diaries. That's because diaries are personal. And in this collection of papers, we have the diaries of the original Lucy, the wife of James. I have read at them and it's tough. She was pregnant or recovering from pregnancy most of her life. She lost 5 of her 7 children in infancy. She lived during her active adult life was the first 30 years of the 19th century, the era of the Great Awakening, great religious revival. She is terribly, deeply religious. And she's ill for most of the time. She ends up developing consumption, TB, and dies a long, lingering death. And we've got her diaries for 30 years in here, and they're extensive and they're painful to read. I'm not going to talk about her. Her daughter is much more readable and usable. Her daughter is Lucy Douglas Fowler, married Gillett. She's born in 1830. Her mother dies when she's 9 years old, and her father remarries. And she dies in 1916. Let me quote something she wrote very late in her life. Since I find myself the last of my family, I think of many events which I cannot remember distinctly, or about which I wished I could inquire of my elders. And is with deep regret, I reflect that the opportunities to do so are now forever gone. Therefore, I have resolved to write out before I go what I can remember of the scenes and surroundings of my early days, thinking they may interest my children when I am gone. It's a classic introduction to a memoir. Her memoirs are very, very good. If you want to know anything about 19th century Westfield, she's a place to go. And you can, because again, Eloise Fowler Salmon has helped you. In 1946, Lucy Fowler Gillett had been dead for 30 years. And her daughter, Miss Lucy, is very elderly herself at this point in time. And she approaches her cousin, that's Eloise Fowler Salmon, and the historian, and says, we need to do something with my mother's memoirs. Will you work with them? And she does, and she prepares a typescript. It's entitled Early Recollections of Mrs. Edward Bates Gillett. This is in 1946. She prepares it. It's in the reference room of the library in the Westfield room so that you can get at it. The problem is, it's very, very good, very informative. The problem is, these memoirs are highly edited. Now, as I told you, we have boxes of diaries, letters, all kinds of writing. Now, what Eloise worked with is a notebook, or notebooks like this, right? These are the notebooks as apparently written late in her life by the mother as she wants to leave the memory for her children. But you can see these yellow sheets and numbers and things over on here. This has been edited by Eloise Fowler Salmon. She's rearranged this. She's left things out. She's organized it into a manuscript. I can tell you there are 5 of these, and that's fairly short. So that's one thing. But there's a bigger problem. Somebody went to the original sources. Now, Mrs. Gillett, in her youth, kept little diaries. There's poetry, there's jotting, there's diary entries, there's journals. So we have these. But somebody has gone through and cut pages out. In every one of them, there are cut pages. Now, did the owner of these decide in her old age she'd go back through and read them, and maybe there were things in here she didn't want other people to see and she cut them out? Could be. Did her daughter, after her mother died, reading her mother's thing? Now, her daughter, in any indication I've ever got. Now, remember, I'm a stranger to all of this, and I came after all these parties died. But when I was new in town 50 years ago, I talked to people who knew Miss Lucy. And the stories told about Miss Lucy is that she is, remember, she's born in 1856. She is a classic Victorian maiden lady. Did she go through her mother's journals and decide there were things that were not appropriate and remove them? No. Now, her mother also apparently decided to begin this memoir earlier than that little quote I gave you. That quote is from the 1890s. But not only are those little journals, there are also a couple of hundred pages like this that begin in the 1870s. But obviously you can't see it. This says diary page 8. And the next one says page 10. And again, there are pages missing. And sometimes we'll get one and we've only got half a page, so bottom half is gone. But I can tell you, and what we've got left is at least 4 or 5 times the size of that typescript journal. I have never worked my way through all of these. I'm not sure I'm going to live long enough to do it, but they're here for some researcher someday to have a field day creating the 19th century world of one of the most prominent people in town. This is the problem with dealing with these papers. Any researcher loves to have collections like this. You can find wonderful things. You can raise questions you can't answer. But you can get an insight into a world that has left us a long time ago. Generally, we love them, and we have a lot of them. Some of these memoirs are published. There is Robert Parker's memoir of growing up in Westfield in the late 19th century. That's published. You can get the books off the shelves in the Westfield room. There's Moran's publication. He was in the whip industry and had properties here in town. He published his memoirs. Gillette wrote his memoirs. Noble wrote his memoirs. We have collections of typescript memoirs, which you can get access to if you want to see the 19th century. If you do, you can enter a world that's long past. They're collected here in the archives, and they're part of the treasures that are here for people to work with. Thank you. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I find it fascinating what you're talking about today, and I'm wondering, are collections still being made? So years from now, when I'm dead and gone, it's going to be of this time period?
Well, one of the problems with that is that people don't write anymore. People use the internet.
Okay.
You know, it's sort of like my children when the grandkids were young, took pictures of the grandkids. But they sent them on the damned internet. That's not a picture of the grandkids. It's there on the internet. Okay, you can look at it. We've got thousands of photographs. I'm a Luddite. I can't do that stuff. And partly it's because I just showed you a 200-year-old memoir that, if there is any kind of decent care at all, will be here for another 200 years. With that damn thing, what you got stored in there, if the technology changes next week, you've lost. Unless you've upgraded. I know you can upgrade. People assure me you can go back and upgrade. What do you do with the 2,000 discs you've got stored away somewhere if you haven't upgraded them? This survives somehow. We're still collecting things. Collections are still coming in. And we're doing our best to grab, as they come along, documents and things which are representative of our time. We just finished the 350th anniversary, and we've just moved into the archives here all the records of the committee that ran that. So where things are available, yes, they're coming in. Yes. Anything else? Yeah.
When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I sold Lucy Gillette a Christmas wreath. And I remember her electric car parked right out here on Fourth Street.
Yeah, there's lots of tales. The tale that I ran into most usually is that because she had spent most of her life in the world of horses and buggies, when she drove her car and wanted to stop, she just stopped and got out and left it wherever she was. She didn't worry about parking or anything else. So I've heard lots of tales about Miss Lucy. All right, yeah,
Another use for the archives, which we just discovered, we put on the historic lectures at First Church. And our next lecture, coming up, Bob has told me there's all sorts of letters from this person in the archives that he's gonna come take a look at. That he wrote when he was in the war, and he said every couple days, he said, and luckily his family kept these letters, donated to the library. So when you ask, are things being kept from this period? Yeah, well, from later period, yes, please. If you know, and being on the historic commission, if you have any old papers from anyone in your family, please don't throw them away. Somebody will want to take a look at them. Us.
yeah, it's amazing how the most ordinary things become terribly important over time. I mean, Aurelia Taylor's journal, it's a journal of a very ordinary woman in a very small town who's just getting by. That's all it is. But 200 years later, it's a terribly important way of understanding what we were. Terribly important. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Next month, it's going to be church record, technically First Church.
Oh, really? I have some.